So, hello everyone. According to my tech wizard in the background, we should be recording now. And so welcome everybody to this LGBT plus History Month event on Trans Youth Speak Out. We are LGBT plus Labour. We are a socialist society affiliated to the Labour Party. And though I do want to point out that just because someone is on this call doesn't imply anything about their relationship to the Labour Party specifically. We, for LGBT plus History Month, we've been successful at getting a wide variety of organisations to speak for us, including organisations that are not affiliated to the Labour Party, so I just want to say that up front. And we are doing an event on trans youth today. And before we do this, I just want to check that one of the participants is here because they've disappeared off the screen. Just a second. Sorry, just in the background. Sorry for that tiny clack. And so, yeah, so first of all, I'm going to very quickly introduce our panelists. Can one person introduce themselves, please, just with their name and pronouns? I'm going to pick Dylan first.
Okay, I can go first. Hey everyone, my name is Dylan. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm really excited to be here tonight to answer some of your questions and have this discussion. It's a really important topic, and yeah, so it's this point we hand over to the next person.
Amazing. Rosa, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, hello, I'm Rosa. They, them, or she, her pronouns. I'm I'm the trans place on the NUS Liberation Committee, and yeah, I'm looking forward to talking about what issues are like the most pressing when it comes to the liberation of trans youth today.
Amazing. And finally, we have Torr. Torr isn't able to use their camera today, but we're still hoping to get an introduction from them.
Yes, I am Torr. I use they or she pronouns. I am the trans officer of London Young Labour and also chair of Labour Campaign for Trans Rights.
Amazing. And so just to start off with a little bit of a preamble, trans youth have become incredibly visible over the past few years. While trans people have often been in the shadows of popular culture, often quite ugly shadows, now we have a wide variety of trans influencers and actors and actresses. And even within like the realm of trans youth, we've increasingly had more trans people playing trans roles, including Hunter Schafer in Euphoria, Ian Alexander in The OA. We have Jazz Jennings, who's done a lot of very public work, as well as Lachlan Watson, who stars in The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, which is a personal favourite. And so we've become much more visible as a community, not just young people, but all of the community more broadly. And alongside this visibility, there's come increasing challenges to the ability of trans youth to be open about themselves, to be honest, and to access healthcare and education safely. And that is what this event is about today. We are talking about the ability of trans youth to access education and healthcare, what barriers are currently in the way, and how we are going to overcome those barriers. So this event is going to be a little bit guided by my questions because I'm very nosy and I want to ask people some questions as well as questions from the audience. And so as you'll be able to notice on Zoom, we have a Q&A function. Please, if you have any questions about relating to the event, which is the rights of trans youth to access education and healthcare, please put them in the Q&A box. We'll be accepting questions only for all of our panelists, because I think that's the fairest thing to do, rather than targeting particular panelists individually. And so if you have any questions for all of our panelists, then please feel free to put them in the Q&A box and we'll get to them in the latter half of this meeting. And so the first question that I have for panelists is, what are the biggest challenges for trans youth accessing education and healthcare? Obviously a big question, but I'm hoping that all of you will be able to bring different elements to the sort of challenges. Who wants to go first?
I don't mind going first.
Go on then, Dylan.
So I'd say there are definitely a lot of challenges. And firstly, when it comes to education, even though now we are meant to be at a point where we have inclusive education for all, and that includes inclusive relationship and sex education that includes all LGBT plus identities. When I speak to trans young people that are still in school, they have told me, including someone called Marcus, who I spoke to at a youth group, and he said to me that actually trans people just are missed off during those lessons. Nobody educates about trans people, and he sat there 15 years old in a class and nobody's learning about him, and that makes it difficult for him to just even be part of the education process in the first place. But I think part of the problem is, why are we focusing on teaching about this at age 14, 15? There are trans kids as young as 7 that I'm aware of, and so why aren't we teaching young people that some people are trans in the same way that we teach people that some people have 2 mummies and some people have 2 daddies, and that's okay, and that's a different way of having a loving family, and to what you may have seen in the past, which I think would be a really positive way forward, and a problem that, and to address the problem that currently exists. And I would definitely say with healthcare, it seems that the odds are just stacked against trans young people, and there are just some really hateful people out there that care more about pursuing their own hateful agendas than actually listening to trans young people and what they need from the healthcare services. And I'd definitely say there isn't enough being done at the moment to improve trans healthcare services. It's just kind of just sat there to just, and nobody's doing anything to sort it out. And so yeah, that's a bit from me.
Yeah, that is an incredible, albeit heartbreaking summary from Dylan there. I think it'll be really interesting getting Rosa's opinion, especially on access to education, given that Rosa works with trans students across the country.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, obviously education's the big one for me. But yeah, on top of all the stuff that Dylan said, there's a lot of stuff about how, like, a lot of the time, like in the university context, when trans people come up in the content of people's degree courses and stuff, they're either sort of just mentioned as, like, very briefly as like a footnote, and then not really given any sort of actual, that, like, sort of just not talked about in any actual detail. So it's sort of similar to what Dylan was saying about like issues with teaching in primary and secondary education. But then on top of that, there's just a lot of the time when trans people do get, like, talked about in lectures and stuff, beyond just like trans people exist. And next slide. It very, very frequently sort of just, or devolves into either just outright transphobia, or just generally not really getting it, and kind of a lot of the time it's like sort of gender essentialist sort of thinking that ends up being introduced to when trans people are mentioned in lectures and things. And quite a few of the trans people at Manchester, which is the university I'm at, are also psychology students. So and of all the courses where trans people are likely to be mentioned, that's unfortunately quite high up the list. So yeah, there's an awful lot of just entirely wrong things. Like,
Yeah.
Um,
Like, go on, sorry.
And then beyond that, there's the usual things that I spend an upsetting amount of time talking about, which are gender neutral toilets and other gender neutral facilities, and being able to get your name and gender marker changed with the university on the admin side of things, which are just quite simple things that shouldn't be anywhere near as complicated as they are. But
Like, definitely. I think that's something which a lot of people don't realise over discussions over the Gender Recognition Act, is that a lot of the barriers to getting the correct like name and gender marker goes much beyond the GRA and doesn't necessarily require GRA, which is one of the reasons why students can do such amazing work in encouraging institutions to have like trans-friendly institutions where you don't need a gender recognition certificate. And so finally for this round, we'll go to Torr.
Yeah, so there is a lot of issues. As Dylan said, there is a huge amount of issues that trans youth particularly face in accessing education and healthcare. I think first it's important to say that obviously young people in general have been under pretty consistent attack for the past decade or so, really, just through austerity and sort of continued neoliberalism and Tory government, which has just made life consistently worse for young people. And obviously this goes doubly so for trans people, really, because if things are bad for cis young people, then they're especially bad for trans young people. And so in terms of accessing education and healthcare, obviously, like if so you've got obviously things like tuition fees, which aren't a specifically trans issue, but are a general issue, which for trans people who are maybe living in poverty or are disproportionately homeless, or don't have stable work and a kind of strong support network, it becomes especially hard to access education. And similarly with healthcare, really, if you don't have those kind of support structures in place, then it becomes very hard to access healthcare. And sort of continued cuts to the NHS have made this even worse. Obviously, wait times have gone up for everyone, but for trans people, wait times are up at, I think it's up to like 5 years now, which is just absurd. So these kind of issues aren't generally talked about as trans issues, but they are trans issues, right? If these are issues that are just generally cutting our kind of social support system and our sort of welfare system, then these are issues that impact trans people doubly so. And kind of diving in more specifics on those particular areas, like it's very hard to access either of these things if you are homeless, and obviously a huge amount of trans people are homeless because they have families that don't accept them or are abusive, and then to get out of that you have to find a different source of shelter, and that's especially hard if you have extortionate rents and very insecure tenancies, which we do. And so again, that's why this is a sort of key trans issue. Similarly, employment, especially for education, it's very hard to go into education, especially full time, if you can't find some kind of source of income that can maintain you during that, be it part-time or full-time. And so the rise of extremely precarious work has made that especially hard for trans people, particularly because if you have weak workplace rights, it's very hard to defend against transphobic bosses and discrimination at work. And this is comes onto another kind of issue that isn't typically talked about as a trans issue, which is the strength of our workplace rights and the strength of trade unions, both of which have been kind of undercut repeatedly in the past 10 years, and has made it particularly hard for trans people to kind of call on the rights that we do have in the Equality Act and in workplace legislation, to actually defend us against being discriminated against in work. So yeah, these kind of issues, I think they don't seem to be directly related to sort of trans people's access to healthcare and education, but they really are. And I think they're a big part of why so few trans people feel able to actually go into education, go and access healthcare and maintain it. So yeah. Oh, you're muted, Eden.
There's always one, and today that one has been me. And so there seems to be multiple layers of this, where obviously there are the discrete levels that are like maybe like a little bit more unique to trans young people, in terms of struggles getting name changed and not having access to appropriate youth groups. But there's also like the wider structural issues as well, and both of those sort of combine to sort of double whammy trans people in a way that is obviously very distressing. The next question we have, which is like, what misconceptions of transitioning as a young person would you most likely to dispel? And I'm asking this question because there's been a lot of representation of young trans people essentially as victims of gender ideology, and who are being tricked into it because they just don't know better, and they need to be protected from transitioning in a rhetoric that is all too similar to what we saw in the 80s, 90s, and noughties around young gay, lesbian, and bi students, and young people more broadly. What do you have to say on that? Like, what myths would you like to dispel? I'm going to go to Dylan first.
Well, I'd definitely say myths that surround the whole kind of trans community, like in terms of young people. A few that I always hear and I agree with myself is I think the first myth is the fact that everyone has pronouns. A lot of people think that only trans people have pronouns because we talk about them in the sense that when we come out, we say, actually, these pronouns fit us better. And that just everyone has pronouns. When someone else refers to you and says, oh, that's her coat, that's car keys, that's their umbrella. Everyone uses pronouns on a day-to-day basis for themselves and for other people, yet they don't seem to understand that. But yet when it comes to trans people, all of a sudden we're not allowed our pronouns, and that apparently that's something up for discussion. When I would like to ask those people, well, you know, when do you use pronouns? Do you know what a pronoun is? And that's definitely one myth. And a second one that I'd go with is the fact that we're still ourselves no matter what, whether we say that we're trans or cis, gay, lesbian, bisexual, etc. We're still ourselves, and we're still the person that you always know. Yes, some things are going to change because we found a name and pronouns that make us happier, but ultimately that's something that it could be celebrated and supported, because being able to find the language to best describe ourselves and say, actually, this is what makes me happy, is definitely something that a lot of those people, as you mentioned, Eden, have some sort of problem with. But there really isn't a problem about young trans people being happy, and I think every kid deserves to be happy.
What a controversial opinion. Every child deserves to be happy. But yeah, absolutely, Dylan. How about you, Rosa? What misconceptions would you like to push back against or challenge?
I think like the first, like the big thing about the idea that parents or just the trans lobby, which doesn't really exist, are like pushing children into transitioning, or just pushing people in general into transitioning, because like with these arguments about how they're transing the children, like a lot of the people making these arguments are already advancing to trying to prevent any trans person from being able to like transition in any sense. And it's like it's really frustrating, because it's just like it's pretty much just as simple as young trans people and trans people generally know who they are more than anyone else is probably going to, and it's I don't know how to like get across that like being trans is just like a sort of normal human variation, I guess. Weirdly sort of uncomfortable word to use, but yeah, it is. Oh, yeah, because it's like it's just like, especially with the idea of like young people transitioning, or even like trans adults transitioning, it's the idea that being trans is something that's best avoided, or is scary, or just it's just inherently miserable or harmful, which just isn't true whatsoever. And in the healthcare context, especially, since unfortunately I have experience of trans healthcare for young people in the UK, but it's just the sort of denial of bodily autonomy for trans children. Like when I was seeing a psychologist at the Gender Identity Development Service, they sort of tried to push the idea that my parents had sort of like encouraged me too much into being trans, which is just not. No, they didn't at all. And like beyond that, like with the whole bodily autonomy issue, is like specifically as an autistic trans person, which is part of why I'm not very good at public speaking. It's like autistic people like regularly get denied the sort of basic bodily autonomy and get assumed to not know what they're doing, or that somebody else must have decided what they're doing for them. And that very much also plays into a lot of trans people and trans young people being denied healthcare, because there are a lot of autistic trans people, which is pretty good. Yeah, I think it just sort of boils down to everybody deserves bodily autonomy. Children deserve bodily autonomy. Autistic people deserve bodily autonomy, and trans people deserve bodily autonomy, because it's just, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And I think what you're talking about speaks to very much a challenge to the idea that transness is an illness or a pathologized condition, and the cure is to transition. And it's very much that framing which a lot of anti-trans people use, because they're claiming that, well, people being misdiagnosed wrong, when actually the only way, like at least in my view and the view of like most people who are campaigning for trans healthcare in the UK, is the only way to determine whether someone wants transition-related healthcare is just to ask them whether they want it, because there's not really any further like diagnosis process that you can do, because otherwise it's just entirely mental health professionals putting their own ideas of what a trans person is onto another person, which like you have like so like clearly and like painfully experienced. And so moving on to Torr, just to reconfirm, what conceptions of transitioning as a young person would you most likely to dispel? Calling on Torr Robinson.
Hello. Yes, I'm still here. Yeah, so there's a lot of myths here. I'm going to speak kind of generally about this. So I think the first thing to kind of say, or really reinforce, as has already been said, is that trans young people are always kind of the football politically here. We're always the ones who are kind of constantly discussed as the most like important aspect of this, and as the kind of biggest area of quote unquote concern for transphobes. And when you read newspaper headlines, it's not generally like, you know, trans people deciding to transition at the age of like 25 or 30. That's the concern. It's like unprecedented numbers of trans youth transitioning. And this is kind of the scare story always. And you see this with really just absurd concepts that have been created, like rapid onset gender dysphoria, which is basically just a again completely absurd concept, which is that like being trans is some kind of social contagion of some kind. I've got no idea what kind of scientific or psychological evidence this has behind it, but yeah, I don't know how you can produce any kind of meaningful intellectual framework to explain this concept, but in any case, and part of this is this kind of notion that there's like older trans people are kind of actively turning impressionable young people trans, and it's a kind of predatory thing that's happening, and a lot of this is just a retread of the same kind of bigotry that was employed against gay people and still is employed against gay people, which makes it quite a painful irony, really, that there are people who claim to support LGBT people or who kind of call on these notions and stereotypes and this bigotry. I think the reason that young people are constantly kind of the area of most concern is that it's really an attempt to kind of eliminate our right to exist and try to force our community out of public society entirely, because it kind of works on two fronts, where you turn anyone who is an older trans person into a predator, and create this notion in the kind of public space, whilst making it incredibly hard for young people to transition, and also, you know, giving them the kind of awareness that if you do transition, then eventually you will end up being painted as a predator. You know, if this is always the kind of process that happens here, where when you're a sort of young person who's trans and wants to transition, you can still be saved. But if you do transition, then you are now lost and therefore have become this kind of malicious force, right?
Yeah. So we have many more questions to get through, and so I'm very keen to make sure that we answer as many of them as possible.
No
but yeah,
worries.
I think what you're saying, I think, is like our community elders who are really concerned about this area because it smacks so much of the rhetoric over Section 28 are absolutely right. And I think that like there has to be like a wider defense from like the wider LGBT movement, because what we'll see if one of us is attacked is that other groups will be attacked, and we'll see lots of the progress that we've made on LGBT plus inclusive SRB be sort of rolled back in a way that's really, really not great. The final question which I have specifically is, what can activists and allies do in their local community groups to help to support trans young people? We're going to go to Dylan first.
I'd definitely say the first and like the biggest thing that you can do is what I like to call a gender language challenge. So think about, for the next 24 hours, what language you're actually using, and if it's gendered, is it necessary for that language to be gendered, and how can you change that language to make it more inclusive? So one would be, for example, ladies and gentlemen actually invalidates non-binary people in spaces, which really isn't okay. So think about saying something like hello everyone or hello guests instead, which is just as formal but includes everyone in a space, because that shows that you have an awareness that there are more than two genders in society, and very likely to be in the space that you're speaking in. And also just in senses of when you're saying like using other greetings, etc., just think about is that gendered language necessary? And also secondly, be a proud ally. So if you work in a setting with young people, having a little like an ally badge, there's a flag for allies, or just wearing a pride flag like the one in the background on your lanyard at work will show all LGBT and particularly trans young people that you're a safe person to talk to. And also use your pronouns, introduce yourself with name and pronouns, have them in your email signature, so then people can see that you have an awareness that gender expression does not equal pronouns, and that you understand that pronouns are just as important as your name.
Okay. Rosa, you're up next.
Yeah, so sort of echoing what Dylan was saying, it is like making sure that whatever spaces you're part of are safe for trans people, and making that obvious to any trans people who might be starting to come into that space, or also um, and like making it obvious to anyone who might be thinking about joining whatever spaces you're involved in. It really is just as simple as making sure that that people know that they're going to be safe being trans in that space, and all the stuff about pronouns and trying to avoid gendered language and everything is an important part of that. And then I think, sort of going back to what I was saying before about bodily autonomy and stuff, it's along sort of similar lines. It's just sort of believing that trans people are who they say they are, and especially given the topic of the conversation, also given everything that's going on at the moment, especially believe trans children and trans young people. And I think because I think a lot of people are quite threatened by the idea of like a trans young person coming out as trans and then realizing that they're not trans, or sort of, and I think most, if not all of the problems that could come from thinking for some period of time that you're trans and then realizing maybe that you're not, like almost all those problems would be resolved by sort of accepting that that's the sort of like taking time to figure out like how you identify is completely fine and shouldn't be made more difficult by like people like interrogating you if they want to, or if you want to access healthcare or access anything, and just sort of making it so people don't have to jump through hoops to sort of explore who they are, who they might be, and just sort of accepting that like possibly being trans isn't some sort of like exceptionally different massive thing compared to any other sort of way you might possibly think something about yourself and then realize after a while maybe not, or like it's just another way of being a person. I don't know how else to word it.
Yeah, I think that like a lot of people who are like not necessarily as informed this area assume that once a young person has come out as trans, that's the identity that they're going to have for the rest of their lives. When I know that wasn't the case for me. Like when I came out as trans originally, I am now a different brand of trans, and I think that's true for a lot of different people. And it is letting like trans young people know that we're going to love them regardless, like whether they detransition, whether they retransition, which I think is much more common in terms of transitioning in like not necessarily a backwards direction, but in a northeasterly direction, shall we say. And like obviously letting people that we know them, that we love them or support them regardless, means that people actually do have that flexibility and that support to know that if they feel as though they don't want to continue on a particular path, they can change it without people being disappointed in them or feeling as though someone has lied to them or whatever. And so finally on this question, Torr.
Yes. So I think there's a lot that trans people and allies can do in their communities. I think we have to really try and organize in the spaces that we do have. There's can be a lot of different places. It can be schools, it can be students' unions, it can be trade unions, it can even be political parties, and just community groups in general. There's a lot of work that I think can be done in communities and in community groups. Obviously, trans people, I spoke a bit before about these kind of issues, but trans people who are in abusive houses and need to try and get out of them. It's something that community groups can do which is provide a support network that allows trans people to get out of those spaces, and to get out of households when they can't be out. Similarly, community groups can do mutual aid to kind of even just a small amount of like mutual aid to keep someone above water, right? But also more kind of complex and bigger things like clothing swaps, so you can afford clothing that you know it's sort of gender affirming, and fundraising for transition. These are kind of bigger things that community groups can do and that you can organize for. But beyond that, I think this kind of organizing is very effective because it also allows you to kind of build some power, right? By getting people into a place where they aren't, you know, constantly facing going on below water, they are able to kind of do more political organizing and become more politically active. And we can kind of organize around policies like a fully funded NHS with informed consent, social housing, so you can get out of these abusive households, and strong workplace rights and strong unions. And this is, I think, an important part of this, because you can mitigate the problem with the first kind of set of things, but you can't solve it unless you have the latter. And by organizing around these issues, you can kind of work towards doing both of these things at the same time. The next thing I think that you can do in your communities and in these kind of spaces is try to organize in solidarity with others. And I mean, for young trans people, the first thing is to organize in solidarity with older trans people as well. And this is for the same reason I put forward earlier, which is that we need to try and combat this notion that older trans people are predators and that they've somehow tricked us into transitioning, and try to push back against both the kind of aspects of this process, which, you know, takes away our autonomy as young people, and also makes older trans people into something malicious. And by organizing solidarity with older trans people as well, you can push back against that. But also you can organize in solidarity with others, with other LGBT plus people, with people who aren't trans or LGBT plus, but who are facing similar kinds of issues. You know, social housing and a funded NHS and workplace rights aren't issues which only apply to trans people. They're issues that apply to many people across different groups, and you can organize in solidarity around them. And this allows you to kind of fight back against this narrative that trans people are taking from others. This is quite a strong narrative that is pushed, which is that trans people are kind of, there's a limited amount of resources in society, and trans people want an unfair amount of them. As well as this kind of notion that trans people are just kind of like privileged liberals or something who just want to again just take from society. And if you can organize in solidarity with other groups around these kind of issues, you can really push back against that. And I think as well, it's a way to kind of massively broaden your support base. It's a way to kind of gain strength in numbers, because as I say, these issues affect so many people. By organizing around them, you're able to kind of build a strong political base to achieve that kind of transformational change that allows you to actually solve these issues.
Amazing. Thank you for such wide-ranging and thoughtful answers, everybody. We're now going to be moving to the user-generated element of this event. And so we're going to be answering some attendee questions. I guess that first thing to say is we've only got a couple of questions so far. And so if anything that you have heard has like provoked a thought, and you would like to hear others' thoughts on sort of the idea that you've just come up with, please put them in the Q&A function. And so we're going to go to the first question I'm going to ask the panelists is, how do we challenge left-wing women in our local Labour Party who insist that trans youth are not trans and instead are heavily influenced by peer pressure, trans ideology, and social media? I'm not going to say that, but I think that's quite a big question, so I'm not going to say that we should go in a particular order. I'm okay for people to answer that, depending on who has thoughts first.
I'm happy to answer.
Go on then, Torr.
So there's, I have a few things to say here. In terms of local Labour parties and really just anywhere, I kind of make a distinction in between two types of transphobes. The first type is ideological transphobes, which are just people who have an ideological commitment to transphobia, and they believe all this stuff about like trans ideology and so on and so forth. And the second type are just general transphobes who don't really know any of this stuff or know anything about it, but are just transphobic because society is transphobic, essentially. And the way you kind of deal with these two different types is different, I think. In the latter type case, you can try and do some kind of political education, right? And you can try to combat this kind of generalized transphobia that's just been imbibed by living in a transphobic society with that education, right? And that's, if that works, then you have one less transphobe at the end of it. If it doesn't, then it hasn't worked, and they kind of begin to fall into the former category. So in the former category, which is typically where these kind of transphobes in local Labour parties are, the only well, not the only, but the best way, I think, to kind of overcome them is really just with organizing. You just have to out-organize them. They are very organized, and they are pretty effective at doing it. And this has been part of why there's been so much transphobia in the Labour Party over the past few years, is just a lack of organizing from trans people and allies, and a lot of organizing by these kind of quote unquote gender critical feminists. And if you want to kind of push back against that in the Labour Party and this kind of transphobia in local CLPs, then organizing is the most effective way. Obviously, there are kind of other things that you can try and organize for in the party, like a proper code of conduct on transphobia, which would go a long way to making CLPs much safer for trans people to organize in. But yeah, I mean, organizing is just the best way. It's very difficult to convince someone out of being an ideological transphobe, but you can overcome it politically.
Cool. Do either Dylan or Rosa want to chime in this point?
Yeah, I'd definitely say something that I would add to what Torr just said is also finding common ground between general feminist campaign points and fights that the trans community experience. So, for example, I want a hysterectomy. I cannot stand the fact that I have a uterus, and I want it gone ASAP, ideally. But I honestly don't have the energy to have the fight with my GP about my bodily autonomy and the fact that, no, I don't want to carry children, surprise, surprise. And so that's a fight that not only trans masculine and trans men experience like myself, but also women, cis women in particular with, say, endometriotis, who may want a hysterectomy to alleviate the problems that they're experiencing, but they're told that, oh no, and the doctor then tells them, oh no, but what if you want children? Not thinking about the fact that the daily pain that they're in might be a bit more than a minor inconvenience and something that they want to put up with for that. And then it also reinforces this idea that there's only one way to have children and start a family. There are many other ways to start a family, including surrogacy and adoption, which are just as beautiful and just as loving. And I would definitely say that finding those common grounds does make trans people more human, because sometimes people don't see us quite as human as other people, will treat us like second-class citizens. But when people can see trans people in a light that they already understand, it helps us become less scary and not those people that the Daily Mail like to talk about on a regular basis. I mean, they really should become fictional authors. It's quite something sometimes.
Okay, and finally, Rosa, do you have any insight to draw on this, maybe not from within the Labour Party, but from other community groups that you're involved in?
Yeah, I think what Torr said about not trying to convince ideological transphobes, just trying to sort of out-organize them and just sort of make it so that their transphobia sort of doesn't have any impact beyond, or I guess has minimal impact, makes a lot of sense, because yeah, in all the work that I do with NUS and with my students' union, trying to convince transphobes just just hasn't been productive whatsoever, and just trying to do whatever you can in support of trans people and also just in support of feminism more generally, because as Dylan touched on, like the issues of trans people and the issues of women as if there's a distinct categories, which obviously they're not. Like feminism and the rights of trans people just aren't at odds with each other, as like aren't just like inherently at odds with each other. Yeah, the conversation over whether gender critical feminism is feminism, that's too complicated for me to bother going into. But yeah,
it's okay. We have many other questions. And so I guess this is more of like a specific one, and people may not have the personal experience to answer this, but I think it's interesting to ask anyway. How do we overcome the attitude of some religious people who believe that being trans is a sin?
So I have a little bit of experience when it comes to this, because when I came out, one of my mother's various amusing lines was that it somehow offends her religion that that there were other people referring to me with a name that wasn't my Christian name, because unfortunately I was baptized against my own will because I was 6 months old and I didn't have any say in the matter, and so I would definitely ask them about other points, particularly if we go to Christianity, which is something that I'm more familiar with. As in particular, I riled myself up like with all of these lines ready to throw at my grandma before I came out to her, and then she was absolutely fine and said that she thought that there was a problem, and that's why I hadn't spoken to her in a while, not the fact that I'm trans. I definitely say one of them is, well, the Bible says that you're not allowed to plant 2 crops next to each other. Does that mean we have to go out and punish every farmer that plants 2 different crops in their field? The Bible also says that you can't wear clothes made of 2 different materials. Does that mean we have to go and stone to death everyone that decides to use different materials to make their clothes? No, it's absolutely ludicrous. So why are you deciding to take this one hateful thing from religion when, in all honesty, there are a lot of other things that you just choose to ignore on a daily basis? Why all of a sudden are you making these decisions with trans people? And it's not okay. There's other religions like Judaism, which put the law of the land above. I know some Jewish people take the interpretation, I should be more clear, that the law of the land becomes first before their religious beliefs. That was something that I heard last year on a event to do with teaching about LGBT plus people in schools from a rabbi. And there are Buddhism and not Buddhism, Hinduism. They have lots of different gods and deities that don't necessarily conform to the 2 like genders that somehow colonialism has forced on us. So there are lots of examples within religion that show that actually that trans people exist, non-binary people and people of other gender identities exist. And it is about just challenging the why have you chosen to pick this part of your religion and not the loving, caring parts of, say, Christianity that say love thy neighbor.
That's really comprehensive. Do we have we do have other questions, but I just want to first go to Rosa and Torr to see if they have something to contribute on this.
Go ahead, Rosa.
Oh yeah, I was just going to say my experience of having to convince or deal with like religious people about whether or not being trans is a sin is minimal, so I don't really have anything to add.
Okay. In which case, there are loads of other really good questions, so I am going to move on. I'm going to utilize that executive power. There's a question on the recent legal judgment which restricts young people's access to puberty blockers, otherwise known as Tavistock versus Bell. Could you please say something about this and what campaigning is going on? Who wants to tackle that very thorny issue first?
I was just going to say that, yeah, I mean, it's obviously a very bad judgment that was handed down. It's very bad for trans young people. I mean, something to note on this is that before this judgment came down, the government, I think the Truss specifically, had said that the government was concerned about trans young people accessing puberty blockers and accessing hormones and transition-related healthcare, and said it was a matter of priority for the government to do something about this thing that they view as being very bad. And so, I mean, there's a danger here that even if this judgment had gone the other way, had gone in our favor, it still would have resulted in the government taking some kind of action, either through legislation or government policy, to make it harder for trans young people to access puberty blockers. So it demonstrates how much this issue is kind of in the firing line right now, and how much trans young people are in the firing line, that it's kind of an attack that's happening not just in the courts, but also in the highest levels of government, and makes it something that you can't organize around just through a legal channel, but something you have to kind of organize around politically, and something you have to try and push for in terms of things like Labour Party policy, and in terms of just generally organizing politically to make it difficult for the government to do this. So yeah, it's a somewhat depressing answer, but it does kind of illuminate, I think, what the challenge really is and the scale of the challenge here. And I know there is campaigning happening, but I think my view on it is that we have to kind of broaden it significantly, and not just focus on taking another case to court or just appealing this, because it's an issue that's sort of bigger than that.
Cool. I'm going to go to Rosa next.
Yeah, so sort of echoing some of what Torr said, I think with the Tavistock versus Spell ruling, the idea of a sort of appealing it and then getting it overturned and that being treated as a victory, sort of, I mean, I get why people would think that, but also, right, in my view, the Gender Identity Development Service and gender identity clinics in general, as the only public option available to trans people for accessing healthcare in this country, is just, they're not fit for purpose, even if you can get puberty blockers from them. And I don't think having the gatekeeping system of the Gender Identity Development Service and the gender identity clinics is ever going to be adequate, no matter what you do with it. So yeah, I think trying to push for transition-related healthcare to be moved to a model of informed consent instead of a gatekeeping model like we have now is something that is really important. And I know that in Manchester at the moment there's a pilot scheme called the Indigo Gender Service, which is like largely led by trans people and is like based around informed consent instead of gatekeeping. And I think that when we almost certainly will end up seeing that like that service works a lot better for trans people than any of the existing GICs. Like I think like the argument against gender identity clinics will hopefully be stronger, because the reason they exist, or the reason they were created and the reason they continue to exist, is effectively to deny trans people healthcare as much as possible rather than to give it, which just is pretty obviously just not the way that healthcare should ever be delivered. So
and finally, but certainly not least, we're going to be moving to Dylan, who I know has like an area is especially interested as a law student. And so can you tell us more about what this means, not just for like yourself as a young trans person, but also like as a student in this area?
Well, when I look at the judgment and when I look at the way that the decision that was made, the way it was come to, I just think that, quite frankly, it is embarrassing that the legal profession made such an erratic decision. I think the judges should be embarrassed about the decision they made. Tavistock and Portman's lawyers should quite frankly be embarrassed about the arguments that they made. And Keira Bell's lawyers should quite frankly be embarrassed to claim that someone who specialises in diabetes is somehow qualified to talk about trans healthcare. It really is something that I'm ashamed of as a law student that went through our legal systems. I think first we have to highlight the fact that that Keira Bell was 16 years old when she went on hormone blockers, yet this judgment blocks under 16s from taking blockers and doesn't necessarily block 16-year-olds and over from taking hormone blockers. So one, how is this going to solve this supposed problem that she experienced if you're denying healthcare from people under the age of 16, yet people who were 16 taking blockers just like herself aren't going to be affected by this judgment. Secondly, it just completely takes this myth that somehow hormone blockers are this evil treatment and that is not irreversible at all. Hormone blockers are completely irreversible and they aren't an experimental treatment, because for the past 30 years they have been used in young people whose puberty has onset too early, and to stop that from happening so they can just be a kid without having to deal with puberty at age 8 or 9. Another thing that I'd say is very embarrassing on the judges' part is the fact that they didn't listen to any trans people when they were talking about, when they were making their decision on this judgment, which is just quite frankly wrong. You wouldn't have a panel of men talking about a women's issue. You wouldn't have a panel of straight people talking about gay issues. You wouldn't have a panel of white people talking about black issues. It's just completely unacceptable, and I cannot even begin to understand why they thought that it was a good idea. And finally, Tavistock and Portman's lawyers should have been able to make the argument and that these blockers are perfectly okay. And if they want to have a conversation about partially irreversible treatments, then that's where we go to hormone replacement therapy, which is known to be a life-saving treatment for transgender people. And there's plenty of scientific evidence for that, in the same way that hormone blockers are life-saving, and there's plenty of evidence of that as well. So yeah, I'd definitely say massive embarrassment to the legal system. I'm very, very glad that the Court of Appeal has granted an appeal, and I really hope that this is rectified. And I somewhat hope that it goes to the Supreme Court and a ruling is made in our favour, because it then will force the government to do something in the same way the government were forced by Bellinger and Bellinger in 2003 to create the Gender Recognition Act.
That is an incredibly forceful argument, and I can see the energy emanating from you. And I think that, like, your feelings are very much shared by many others who have been incredibly frustrated by some of the arguments and the outcome of the initial case. That is, however, all that we have time for, because we have hit 7 o'clock, and so I just want to thank all of our panelists for giving up their time tonight to come and talk to us about their experiences and their ideas. And I want to thank my fellow LGBT plus Labour committee member who's behind the scenes helping with all the tech. And so yes, so thank you so much. That is sadly all we have time for at the moment. Though of course we will be having some further conversations. One of my campaign priorities for this year is defending trans youth access to healthcare and education, and this event was part of sort of that campaign. And so this has been some really good political education, and I'm hoping that we'll have some broader work, especially with Young Labour, around these issues more broadly. Until then, I have been Eden Ladley. I am the trans officer of LGBT plus Labour, and I wish you a lovely evening. Thank you very much.